Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, Andrew. Welcome to, I think, the 165 people who've tuned into this webinar, sponsored by Pan Macmillan, publisher of your book, Andrew. And it's a great pleasure for me to be hosting this webinar with you. You're one of the greats, one of the last great foreign correspondents, who's been in almost every conflict zone in the world as a journalist, and you've won awards for your writing. You are currently the foreign correspondent for the BBC, living in South Africa since 2009. You've received an Emmy and many other awards, rightfully so, for your incredible work. We were speaking a bit earlier on before we came live, and I just want to congratulate you, Andrew, on an extremely beautiful, profound, disturbing, magnificent book, which is narrative nonfiction about something that happened in South Africa. And I think I can't recommend the book more highly to South Africans to read, just in terms of what it reveals about us and the deep sorrow and deep pain and our attempts at trying to make sense of this chaotic, wild world we live in. I just want to briefly set the scene for those of you who've joined, and I can see you're joining in from New Zealand, from Pietermaritzburg, Dunedin in New Zealand. Thank you, all of you. The book centers around an event that happened in Parys in 2016, where two black men were beaten and killed by a pack of white farmers who accused them of having robbed one of their relatives. And so the book is situated takes place within the confines of Parys, Tumaholi Township, and two families of white farmers, the fundamentalisms, who farm and live in that particular area and have done so for a very long time in the Free State. Andrew, could you tell us, you say this case crept up on you by accident. Can you just give us a little bit of, you covered the Oscar Pistorius case as well, so you're deeply enmeshed in South Africa's, the archaeology of violence in this country and law particularly. But how did this case creep up on you? And tell us a bit about how you came to it.
Well, thank you for that very glowing introduction. I'm blushing, but much appreciated. As you say, I'd covered the Pistorius trial. I've always, from years ago, I'd been interested in narrative non-fiction crime, like classics like In Cold Blood, The Executioner's Song, Norman Mailer. I even studied them at university, and I suppose so. Somewhere in the back of my mind, there was always an interest in trying to find something that I could write in that sort of way. And I'd been fascinated by the courtroom drama and by the legal processes of the Pistorius trial. And I didn't want to write a book about that case because I was kind of sick of the Pistorius story by the time it was over. And I didn't feel in some ways that it said that much about South Africa. It said a lot about one athlete and his extraordinary story. So I was on the lookout for a tale that I could catch as close to the beginning of and follow through an investigation and a trial. And so I was looking something logistically possible in terms of it not happening too far away from Johannesburg. I was looking for something that I could surrender myself to. So it was a bit of a gamble because who knows how long these cases take. And this one, in the end, of course, took 4.5 years. So that was a real gamble and a real experiment. But when I went down to Parys early on in the beginning of 2016 and sat in the courtroom, sat in the magistrate's courtroom, listening to the politics and the tension in the community, and the sense of this poor local magistrate basically being forced off the case by powerful politicians, I realized that a story that at first I wasn't sure about, because it's about land, it's about race, it's about these issues that tend to drag you to the extremes of South Africa. And I didn't want to tell a story just about the extremes. But the longer I spent in Parys and the more I came to understand what was going on and to see these communities being torn apart, I came to see that this was actually a much more profound story about experiences that I felt weren't just those on the fringes. And because it was a story that was in some ways cut against the usual grain of farm murders, an issue again that is dragged to the extremes, I thought actually this was a story that could allow me to get into the nitty gritty, the complexities of these families.
So in order to do that, in a sense, apart from attending the sort of structurally confined court case, you also then began to, what's so beautiful about the book is that you disappear as the author and place me in the kitchen on the morning that Ruth, who's the mother of one of the murdered men, who become absent in the trial.
We need to be a little bit careful here when we're using words like murders and kills.
Oh, yes.
I don't want to ruin the book,
of course.
But those words aren't appropriate, shall we say.
Isn't that just yeah? Well, that's exactly why the book is so fascinating, because while there are two people who are deceased in the story, who is responsible for their death becomes the issue, and how they come to die. But at the same time, what you're able to do is recreate that morning for me, where Ruth arrives at work as a domestic worker. You know, Ruth's life is that of millions of black women in townships in South Africa, piecemeal work here and there for white families her entire life, badly paid. Same with the men in Tumahole who are working on the farms, young men with very little prospects, being treated badly on these farms as well. And you take us straight into both those worlds, the worlds of the fundamentalisms and their kitchens and their teas and their televisions and their routines, and then the wretchedness perhaps on some level of Ruth and her life. How were you able to reconstruct those scenes? Because that morning, just tell those of us who are listening in what happens that morning. I mean, what is that? That's the beginning of something. I think the fracture and fissure between Ruth and everyone, all the white people.
So this is something that struck me very early on, and that I wanted to make, that it shaped the way I wrote the book, was that you have this one horrific incident of these two black men who are arrested. They are suspected of a farm attack, and this group of white men assault them in turns over a long period of several hours, and the following morning the two men die. The news then spreads throughout the community, and from one perspective, the white farmers are going, well, look, we're constantly in danger. We are vulnerable white farmers who are often being robbed or killed. We arrested two men, we gave them a bit of a beating, but to be honest, that's the end of the story. And then you have the reaction from the black community as they hear the same exact events, and they have a totally different perception of it. The story that they hear is of two men who may not have gone to rob an elderly white man, but who may have gone to ask for unpaid wages. And this, I felt this sort of real sense that I needed to show that the same event could look so different, as it so often does in South Africa, depending where you stand. And so I spent a lot of time, particularly with Ruth, the mother of Samuel Chika, one of the dead men, who let me into her life and told me the whole story as she saw it. And there was this key moment, I thought, early on when Ruth, who works, as you say, for one of the Van der Westhuizen families, and the Van der Westhuizens are this big extended family who own most of the farms. It was a Van der Westhuizen who'd been attacked or confronted by the two black men, had pressed an alarm button and had triggered this whole story. And Ruth, the mother of Samuel, had worked in a Van der Westhuizen family. And from her perspective, when she learned that her son, one of her sons, had died, she was like, why didn't you tell me? How could you have had this information for hours, for a whole morning, and not have told me this? Whereas on the other side, you have this young couple, another Van der Westhuizen couple, on a different farm, and what they have heard is, we've heard that two men have died. We think maybe it's one of Ruth's sons, but we don't want to do the wrong thing. We don't want to spread gossip. We don't want to tread into something that we don't know for sure. So let's treat this cautiously, respectfully, and let's not tell Ruth until she finally confronts them. And so you have this these two perspectives, as poor Ruth Kokota, mother of Samuel, learns that Samuel, or at least one of her sons, has been killed. And so I tried to build that scene into something that really would represent the heart of what I was trying to do with this book.
And it does exactly that, because what it shows you about the fundamentalisms that morning is their inability to be to place themselves in Ruth's position. And what they do is allow her to come to work, dress in her, change into her overalls, and they go and sit in the lounge and watch television and ask her to make them food, and she warms up their food for them, completely oblivious and they are sitting in the lounge as well. So I understand what you're saying, that they didn't want to in any way alarm Ruth or talk about gossip or rumor, but you would think that your human response would be, the minute a human arrives at your house and you realize one of their children might be involved in something, is to show solidarity with her, but the fundamentalisms themselves are caught up in, which becomes later, which you examine in the book, that murder, that killing of two men. It's so bizarre to not actually say what it was. Splits that entire family because of this inability to think beyond just the crisis of the moment, and let's just pretend it's not happening.
You do, and I did, you're right, get this very strong sense from so many of the white farmers and others in the community that they have retreated, that it is too dangerous, too problematic to engage, to work as colleagues, as part of the same community. There is this really deep division, which of course becomes deeper after Simon and Samuel's death. And I mean, there are many different people in the white community amongst the Van der Vestes, and some really, I think, wonderful, strong, good people. And yet with all of them, you get this sense that there's this chasm that separates them from the people who are living next door to them, the people who are living and working in their homes.
And I think also, I'm just sort of trying to continue, because this is such a complex issue in South Africa. What I also found extremely profound in a way was how you didn't shy away from describing in detail some of those attacks on the black farmers attacks as well. I'm not trying to, everyone in South Africa, when they use the word farm attack, has to justify why they are talking about it or not talking about it. But what you simply do is describe for us the extreme viciousness of what has occurred in these people's circle of family and friends, these white people, these fundamentalisms, these farm owners, without judging it. You just explain. I think once you begin to force yourself to confront what happens in one of those farmhouses when a robbery takes place, you understand then the inability of that community to try and cross that divide. So I suddenly am less hostile towards them, and I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, so I mean, picture the scene when you have about 40 white farmers who've responded to the alarm call that is sent out on the 6th of January, 2016, and everybody is in a panic. There's been an attack. Old Ludi van der Vestes, one of the senior figures in the community, has been attacked, possibly killed. No one's sure yet. And what I found as I talked to more and more farmers was that everybody had the same image playing in their mind as they drove across those dusty fields, first to look to see if Ludi was okay, but then to find these two suspected thieves. They were all remembering an incident that had happened 3 years earlier on one of their farms, on a Van der Vestesen farm, where this elderly white couple who'd been invited to basically fill one of these abandoned buildings and to set up a tuck shop, they had been attacked and killed and tortured. An old woman had been violently assaulted. She'd been strangled with barbed wire, then buried in a freezer, still alive, had soft drinks poured on top of her. And when the police finally found her body, and it took them many hours, they couldn't get it out of the deep freezer. So they put this huge chest freezer on the back of a police van, and everybody in the community watched this van with this freezer heading off into Parys, into the nearby town, to defrost. And everybody seems, that I talk to have that image so etched in their minds. And of course, then you have all the other stories, the AfriForum stories, the kind of the politicized stories about farm murders that add to that and build up into the rage that I was so interested in. Why, having arrested Simon and Samuel, having detained them very quickly in the corner of a field, why did they then spend 2-3 hours torturing and assaulting, brutalizing them? And there are many reasons, and there are many different versions of what happened, who did what. But nobody stopped that. Nobody stopped and intervened to stop the brutality. And so I wanted to understand the anger that those men were feeling. And I must say, as I came to kind of explore some of these themes of anger over the next 4 years, it became clear to me that it wasn't just anger directed at Black men or suspected thieves, but that there was a current of anger and violence that I found, for instance, against women, particularly against women. I mean, so many people, not just in the white community, but in the Black community, so many women that I interviewed for the book, so many women who are in the book and who are not in the book, told me of their own incidents of domestic violence.
I mean, you get a sense very much in the book as well that when you allow the women to speak, those who have chosen to throw their lot in with a burly farmer who they've married, how they grow up in that area and that region, there's very little hope of leaving, and so that's what you do, and how these men over the years just gradually, harden, become drinkers. Not all of them, of course, but then if you look at the life as well in Tumahole Township, where workers aren't paid their wages, and sort of you look at that, think about how what it would be like to have worked hard on a farm, for a man who probably doesn't treat you well or ignores you, doesn't see you as an individual, and then not to be paid. And there had been the case, I think, of either Simon or Samuel wanting to go and get money and took sausages off the one farm in lieu of payment, which in one's mind is perfectly reasonable. You owe me money, I'm going to take what I have here. So that once again, that perspective where the white community is absolutely terrified and it has its mind preoccupied with that scene that you describe of the freezer being driven away with the body in it is just unthinkable. But on the other hand, the lives of people in that township, so it was bound to, in some way. So what's interesting as well about the scene of the crime and is that a policeman arrives as well, which is quite interesting. And I think his arrival in some way changes the way the implicated people begin to decide how they're going to explain this later on, or their legal team begins to abuse the police presence in a way. But before we do that, I just wanted to ask how much did the political involvement of political parties in then the ensuing court case lead to it becoming something different from Colini or many of the other court cases we've had to deal with as well? Sorry, so I've taken you on a bit of a walk around.
No, I was still thinking about this idea of violence as a currency, which it clearly is out there in a way that I think it's hard for us to understand living here in peaceful Parkwood. But it is a currency there. As for the politics, to begin with, I had a sense that politics was going to be a huge part of the case. Early on, right-wingers, mostly from outside Parys, came in, protested on the streets outside the bail hearing, a very sort of typical scenes that we've seen, as you say, in Colini, in the Coffin case, elsewhere. And of course, the EFF, ANC demonstrators also there, demanding that the 6 men who were initially accused not be granted bail. And you have this Indian magistrate who says, well, hang on, I'm not playing politics here. I'm not going to get dragged into some sort of Zimbabwe-style politics she kept comparing it to. I'm going to play this by the book. In fact, early on, she tried to avoid presiding over the bail hearings of these farmers because she knew, she said, that it was going to become political. But what I noticed very quickly is that the politics drained away from the case. And I think that's partly because it took so damn long. People lost interest. The elections came and went. The media came, and then, understandably, as the years slipped by, drifted on to more urgent stories, and that left it a story which I hadn't known how it would unfold. As I said before, it was a real experiment to kind of just surrender to the process. But by the end, as the trial concluded in pandemic South Africa, there was almost nobody in the court, and it sort of ended with a whimper, even if it hasn't quite ended. I mean, there's some sentencing days in court later this month, and I'm sure there will be appeals and so on. But the politics, which I think were very interesting and very important early on, kind of drifted away, and we were left with a much kind of rawer story about the families, but also about how the law works. And that's what I found so fascinating about the sort of two different types of law, so natural justice and then the kind of nitpicking defense, which is, of course, what defenses do all around the world.
Let's talk a little bit about that in terms of how Ruth perceived the natural justice or the legal justice, and your sense of also what the structured and ordered space of the courtroom did to the fundamentalisms themselves and the accused, and then the additional accused who came by, and what it led to in terms of a initial omerta or vow of silence between the families and the farmers about what had happened that night, that in a sense, while the law might not have been working for Ruth and the other mothers, it cleaved something, it broke something amongst the farmers themselves. I don't know if I'm correct in seeing that, but tell us a little bit about that.
It is. It's always tricky. I've learned in events like this how much of the book to give away. You don't want people, you don't want people to walk away and go, well, I feel like I pretty much
they would be silly to do that, because it's the writing itself, and as I said earlier on, you've almost like a sponge absorbed not only the geographical landscape, the beauty of it, the ugliness of it, but also the people. So I would buy this book and read it 3 times.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. What happens early on in the case is that the police are trying to break a wall of silence. The farmers, essentially advised by a lawyer, decide that their safest option is to stay quiet, united, say nothing. And there is an early belief, which seems remarkable in retrospect, that they think that actually this may just go to an inquest. After all, they had just arrested 2 thieves, 2 violent thieves who may have had a gun and who threatened and injured an elderly family member. Why wouldn't they rough them up a little bit? It eventually dawns on some of those farmers that maybe this isn't their best route to safety, if you like. And so at the heart of the book, in the later stages, and this is influenced by a breakthrough from the Hawks, where they managed to uncover some extraordinarily damaging, explicit, horrific confession-style WhatsApp messages on the farmers' phones, that you have this betrayal, and this betrayal goes right through the heart of this clan, this aristocracy, this Van der Westhuizen family. And it's the most horrific thing for those families, because they are forced to take sides. There are attempted suicides, there's an attempted suicide, marriages collapse, and people have told me that they think this is something that will never heal, that it will take generations before this split that this trial provokes can heal. And it's all because in those early stages, somehow this family thought 2 black men, well, they were thieves, we can just say nothing. And then that idea of saying nothing and this idea of collective responsibility become huge parts of the whole legal battle. I mean, how do you choose? How does a community, a family choose who pays the price? And what price should these people take? Because, of course, everybody hit Simon and Samuel during those hours. Everybody took part. How do you work out who struck a fatal blow?
What is interesting here, then, as you say, is that they were acquitted of the original charges, or they were just, those charges were dismissed, and that they now face grievous bodily harm charges. But in actual fact, their actions that night, the natural justice of that destroyed those families. What they did in that moment, what they chose to do, it is all of their own making, in a sense, where they sit now. I mean, one of the family members is about to retire, or the policeman, I think, is about to retire. Everyone becomes hugely indebted because they've got to pay lawyers. And as you say, terrible, terrible rifts that are going to remain there, perhaps forever, or until the families disappear or the land gets redistributed in some way. And that's, to me, also the literary nature of the story, that these white South Africans, while they might not represent all white South Africans, that at some point your decision to be complicit in something destroys you, something amoral, something illegal, something wrong, something deadly, in a sense. And you've captured that so beautifully.
Well, it is. It's a poison, yes. And even those who ended up not going on trial, the people who did go on trial feel that the other side of the family, that poison will eventually infect and destroy them. And I suppose I've, as you say, I've seen justice at work in a few different countries. And is prison the only solution? As far as Ruth is concerned, compensation is more important to her. And so you wonder, a 4-year process, lives ruined, marriages ruined. You wonder whether, is there another way? Is there a better way for a community to heal than through the process, this very flawed, very legalistic process that we have?
It's a sort of a ring of fire that they had to step through of their own creation in order to find a sort of humanity, which I don't know if they found. There's some questions I'd like to sort of, those of us who are watching have asked me to ask you, and then I'm going to move on a little bit later on to writing them. But Bulet Tambadu says, I appreciate the word current, Andrew. And now you have said currency, 2 different meanings. But we are South Africans dealing with the sins of the fathers coming through generations. I'd like to ask a white privilege question in relation to book publishing as a whole. This is your offering. Might it be that all the other books of this kind would be more palatable to South Africans if all white authors did the very hard work of co-authoring to bring Black South Africans into the intellectual sharing? That's an interesting question just around writing. I'm not sure if you can answer that, but that is a question.
It's a good question. I mean, I think I was lucky, privileged to have the time, the money to devote to this story. And, South Africa as a whole, it seems, doesn't have that. I mean, publishing, journalism, these are industries under pressure at the moment. And it is very hard to devote that time. What I would say is, on a personal basis with this story, I worked with a local fixer. I've made a radio series in which they've been involved. And I think it's a legitimate question how as an author, one tries to bring other people along. The bigger, I would say, the more structural question is also something, I guess, for publishers and for the industry. And I don't think there's an easy solution, but I think that's an important point that we should all, bear in mind.
I mean, it's just interesting to play with the idea, sort of, how would a young black South African have written this book if there had been an opportunity to do so? We won't know. But what you do state in your afterward, or sort of your last paragraph, your last chapter, is very much your approach to this book. And what I found so beautiful is that you've taken yourself out of the way in terms of deciding what we should think about the various people who feature in the book. The only space I see you is in your absolutely beautiful conjurings of as I said earlier, the physical landscape, the landscapes of the kitchens, the amount of detail you actually have rendered in the book is where you as the writer come into play. So there's this beautiful fertile ground that you've used in, so the decision, how do you tell other people's stories without getting in the way, and you've managed to do this extremely beautifully in this book.
Thank you. Well, and this refers a little bit to the previous question about kind of how would a black South African writer have access to this and be able to do this. My role here as an author, I think, was to exploit my role as an outsider, not as a South African, white or black. So I was very conscious from the beginning that the Afrikaners standing outside court looked at me as an outsider as much as Ruth and Simon Jubeba's family did, as much as the Hawks and everybody else did. I was this strange Englishman coming to a very different part of the world, and I had to work very hard, and I had the luck of the time, as I say, to devote to basically show everybody that I didn't have an axe to grind here, that I was an outsider, didn't speak Afrikaans, didn't speak Sesotho, and that I was not coming here on any particular side. And over time, and it did take years, some people tried to spin me, some people tried to ignore me, and very successfully, as is their right, decided to have nothing to do with me. But people on all sides, I think, eventually decided that it was worth talking to me, and that, they knew the book was happening, that they might as well get their side of the story told. And I know, at least 3 or 4 of the people who figure prominently in the book said that actually to have an outsider to talk to, not as a confessor, but as somebody with, in these very close-knit communities, to have somebody they could sit with for a few hours every few weeks or months and just offload, even if they knew it was going to end up in a book, that actually that was quite healthy at a time when a lot of these people were under so much pressure and stress and anxiety.
There's a question here from Colleen Dardagan. She says, at any time during the 4 years did you find yourself having to question or face the impact of your ancestors on this country?
As I say, I was aware, and I was made aware quite routinely, particularly by some of the Afrikaners, that I was an Englishman, that I had a history. But as I say, that's not how I approached this book, and that's not how I've approached my life as somebody who left Britain at the age of 6 and has lived abroad, both growing up and for the last 30 years as a foreign correspondent. I obviously carry British baggage, but I've chosen a life abroad, and I've tried to, 16 years of my life, working life, so half my career, I have been living and working in Africa. So yes, I'm British, but I try to wear my baggage or carry my baggage lightly.
Well, I think if one is at least aware of one's baggage, then one can decide to put it in a different room. But also you describe how you took time every day when you arrived at the court. Now, a South African journalist might approach this totally differently, being an insider, and how you spoke to the various groups, introduced yourself, made your presence, aware. You made people aware of your presence, and so they understood you were there as this observer, and seemed to have needed you to be there.
It was a sort of careful choreography that I did every day. You can picture this little magistrate's court where the bail hearings and actually the trial itself took place. Mercifully, they didn't move it to Bloemfontein, or it would have been a much longer drive. But yes, every morning the different groups would assemble in the sunshine, and I would make this very overt show of going to each group and standing with them, if they let me into their group, but at least, slowly they would. And yeah, that was part of the kind of my attempt to display that I was not, as some people would do just with their own people. And that felt important to me.
I have a question here from Sean Mavundla. And he says, while apartheid may have ended, also, I just want people to know you've lived in South Africa since 2009 as well. So it's a pretty long time. And being as immersed as you are, you're not somebody off golfing and lying around the beach. And when you're not here, you're in other places, Somalia, Burma. So your sense of yourself in the world is as an observer. But so the question from Sean Mavundla is, while apartheid may have ended, what is evident is that black and white South Africans can live in close proximity but still live deeply apart in various ways and see each other as suspects and less human. My question, is it possible that colonial social relations have survived apartheid and that these racial tensions are evidence of such relations and the continued dehumanization? It's a good question.
A good question, difficult question. I'm not sure. It's so funny talking now about a book in which, as you say, I've tried to retreat as a voice. I've shaped the narrative and chosen, but the whole point of writing this book in the way I did was actually to try and acknowledge that these different truths or these different versions of the truth exist, and that I'm not really in a position as an outsider to navigate them as well as I am to just display them. And so, yeah, of course, all these tensions, all these patterns exist, but Parys is only one story and one part of South Africa, and I don't think it has to be the defining one. That's a cop-out, but I don't think it's not predestined that has to be the way relations here go.
In your 12 years here or longer, 2009, I'm bad at maths as most journalists are, have you seen us change and become perhaps more hardened? Was Mandela's little vision of a rainbow nation, or was it Tutu's really? You know, how have we changed? Have we got worse, do you think? Have race relations got worse, or have they got better, or are we working towards something? I think as an outsider, perhaps, you may be able to see things we can't see.
It's one of the most obvious truths about South Africa, that when you have such an unequal society, you can prove almost anything, positive and negative. So, for instance, my experience of living near Rosebank for a decade is that almost everything has got better. You see this new middle class, black middle class, integrating, you see it growing, you see communities changing, the phones work better, the shops are there, all right, pre-pandemic. So I've seen enormous improvements. And then, of course, you step a few kilometers away and you see what you see what everyone knows in townships has been the struggles and the growing inequality and the growing anger. And I don't know that I have anything particularly new that hasn't been said here, because one of South Africa's great strengths, Marianne, you're part of this, is its extraordinary homegrown journalism that people like me feed on and rely on so much. So South Africa is amazingly good at self-analysis. What I've been struck by is, that 10 years of economic stagnation and 10 years of very sophisticated attempts to sow racial tensions at a political level have their effect. They're very effective. And so there have been moments when I had thought South Africa was on the cusp of becoming, for instance, a true multi-party democracy. And then I've seen it retreat as people wait for the perfect opposition party to come along, or wait for the ANC to renew itself in power, and something that rarely happens in any democracy. And so I've seen those frustrations grow. But I've never felt that South Africa has gone beyond the point where it can't redeem itself. People use this cliff metaphor the whole time of, we're about to go off the cliff. And I think that's certainly inappropriate. We are going down a bit of a slide at the moment. But I've seen plenty of other countries turn round, and all you have to do is travel abroad to Turkey, to Brazil, to other parts of Africa to see quite how much worse things can get and quite how much resilience there still is here, particularly as a journalist in a country where overwhelmingly journalists are still respected, where we can go around, people talk, people aren't scared to talk. So there's an awful lot that's, I think, still here and good.
We mentioned while we were in the green room, which, before we went live here on this webinar, that you'd watched Richard Pavlik and Diana Nelly's film Influence, which is debuting at Encounters. And what you mentioned a few minutes ago to me is very important in terms of trying to understand the role of political technologists, whether they're Russian or whether it's Bell Pottinger, or any other sort of agency in this new shifting geographical space where interests want to disrupt democracy. And I think perhaps this is the first time that you've confirmed, in a sense, for me as a foreign correspondent, that Bell Pottinger campaign had an effect. It's not as if the conditions didn't exist. It's not as if white people didn't dominate the economy. I mean, it's not as if white people are still not advantaged. These are issues we know about, but to politicize them and weaponize them is where the danger lies. And perhaps, this story as well, 2016, gets caught up in that cauldron, and that greater narrative that there needs to be racial tension, there needs to be a racial war, in a sense, keeps the flames going, in a sense. So it's very important to acknowledge the interference of who knows who, interested parties,
and these,
in the conflict.
And of course, as and it's a great film, and you're a fantastic part of that film, Marianne. We should acknowledge that.
Strong-armed into it.
No, truly. And yeah, these tensions don't feed on nothing. There is the inequality that, there are truths there about white monopoly capital and so on. But yes, it's extraordinary, the sophistication and you mention it in the film, or somebody mentions it in Influence, the film, that in a way South Africa and Zuma were the original Trump America. That ability to distract, that ability to kind of manufacture an alternative reality, that cynicism. And I spent a decade in Russia, which invented cynicism on a political level, and which has mastered it. And I still remember, being in Chechnya as the Russian Air Force was bombing Chechen rebels, and the Kremlin saying, "No, we have no Air Force operating in this area. That is not us." And that those sort of bald-faced lies, and that ability to introduce that degree of cynicism into politics.
And in the end, it has casualties. Real people happen to be the casualties on the ground. What is it? There are a few other questions. Jill Murray has asked, and it's a difficult one. I suppose it's more for me than for you, but perhaps you can respond. Johnny Steinberg's, she's quoted the title as One Night in Bethlehem. I'm not sure if that's the correct title, but also Johnny, one of those South African authors who is able to, through the personal and tracking the personal and understanding your gaze in terms of telling a story. She wanted to know, how does your approach compare with Johnny Steinberg's? I'm not sure if that's something you can answer or want to answer.
It's a good question, and obviously Johnny and his amazing books kind of loomed very large. The last book I wrote was about Somalia, and just before it came out, The Mayor of Mogadishu, Johnny put out his amazing book, Man of Good Hope, about a Somali who'd come down to Cape Town. What Johnny does so brilliantly, amongst many things, is to act as this kind of guide. So he tells these extraordinary stories, and then he reflects and interprets and explains with that extraordinary sort of generous intellectual kind of sensitivity and writing. I deliberately chose to do something different in this book, as you mentioned, to take myself out of it as a narrator, as a voice. And that was for a mixture of reasons, partly because I could never achieve what Johnny did, also because I felt that as an outsider, I had a different role to play. And it was something I wanted to do almost on a literary level as well. I felt that this would work better as a non-journalist book, if you like, as just a good read. That I wanted to write a book that you could read, and I hope you can read, and not necessarily know whether it is fiction or fact.
Well, it's just a literary text, so it's that having to straddle. I was just going to say, your reporting for the BBC from South Africa, I would expect covers the grand themes that, or is that something you still do for the BBC as well? Yeah. So you have that, that the exploded view and the grand narratives, and a book recently published which really moved me was Lansdowne Dearest by Bronwyn Davids, and it's a very small personal, the grand apartheid scheme of the laws which forcibly remove people and everything else. But when you get into the personal and what it means for someone to watch their house slowly, people around them slowly dissipating, and the personal effect of apartheid on people's lives, is so much more powerful, and you've been able to do that. I think for me, the first chapter is the most interesting one in terms of collecting your information, because you have to be very careful in that chapter and not to tell us what happened. You have to try and reconstruct it, and I mean, it's extraordinary intellectual feat to do that based on the court evidence, and then of course on the testimonies and the cross-examinations and everything else. So you're able to do it in such a way that I don't know as I enter the story exactly what's happened there. So that's and did you plot that, or did it come instinctually, or did the story just take you that way?
So I'd initially written a very different first chapter. The book initially had a different title, and I had started with a kind of grand view. Actually, I was slightly obsessed by the crater, the Vredefort Dome, the impact site of this huge meteorite, the biggest impact strike that we know of on this planet, and the fact that the two men, Simon and Samuel, died on the eastern edge of that crater. And so I'd started almost with a meteorite's eye view and built up from there and brought it forward to the present. And then I'd decided that actually, I think it was somebody, maybe it was Graham Greene, who talked about, getting irritated with books that don't start with a shot rang out, and that actually I should just stop, that I should kill my darlings and crack on with the story. And so I changed the title, which had been, as I say, Crater's Edge, and I revamped the start and just cut straight into the action. And then I had, I think, more than 1 million words I transcribed over these 4 years of court testimony and long interviews. And then I just decided that I would keep coming at this scene of the crime from different angles throughout the book, but also in the gaps between that, try and build these characters and maintain the suspense about what really happened.
Exactly, that's what it accomplishes. I mean, because we learning as the court does, and as everyone else who wasn't there that night, it slowly unfurls. But I love the idea of your trying to distract yourself with the crater, because often as journalists, we when something is quite painful and difficult emotionally and intellectually to get into, we try and say, look over there, that's but that crater but the notion of it, that existential notion that this is the place where this meteorite hit the ground, and in a sense people have been suffering ever since, in a way. Just a few more questions. We've got a little bit of time left. A question from Jonathan Golden: did you feel any need to censor or protect some of the people, even yourself, during the writing of the story?
There's a fair bit that didn't make it into the book. There are allegations, for instance, of domestic abuse that I both couldn't prove 100%, but also felt it would be unfair on certain people to raise those issues. There wasn't really any more censorship than that, I would say, no, because the structure of the book was to give everybody their own voice and their own perspective. There's I suppose in legal terms, that there's some, need to make sure that when people are alleging appalling things against each other throughout the book, and obviously I had to make sure that that I was giving the opposing point of view due consideration and due prominence, because there's a lot of allegations flying around.
Mm. I think the time also that you've spent with everybody too, and they're opening up, as you said earlier on, seeing you as the outsider, in a sense, allows you to feel less that one needs to censor oneself. Speak to me a little bit about your rendering of the women in this book, because as I've said earlier on, you're completely out of the way. When I follow Ruth looking for these piecemeal jobs and her sons at the abattoir and everywhere else, I get a vivid sense of Ruth's life, and Ruth has lost almost everything. Ruth is adrift and at sea, like so many Black women, impoverished, unable to get out of that awful hellhole. So tell me a little bit about what the women meant to you in the book, because the men are the perpetrators of the violence here, and the women. And as you said earlier on about, generally speaking, this is across the board in South Africa, but in this particular case, did the women bring something to the narrative that was vital?
I don't think I could have written this book if it hadn't been for Ruth and Ricky, two key women on either side, if you like, of the story, who were incredibly generous with their time and their honesty. We've been talking earlier about the title, These Are Not Gentle People, which is actually said by one of the characters in the book, and I don't necessarily want to give it away, what it refers to, but it did strike me after I'd heard this phrase over the weeks and months, as I realized this should be the chapter, this should be the title of the book, that it gets in a way to the heart of what the story is here, which is about male violence. And then the women who not only tolerate or endure or clean up after that violence, but who then tell the stories of that violence. And particularly Ricky and Ruth, who are both extraordinarily bold and open about what was going on in their lives and in their marriages and so on. And so, this does feel in a way like a book told by women about male violence.
And ultimately, then again, as that's why South Africa is so surprising. You wouldn't have thought that you would have found this entire microcosm in such a small circumference of space about everything about South Africa is in this book. Land, poverty, violence, but not in a way that is unpalatable, but in a way that attempts to make sense of it as well. I mean,
or embraces the ambiguity of it. I think that's what I've tried to do. Yeah, that's not to say that there aren't clear-cut outrages and truths in this book, but there are so many perspectives, and that's what I've tried to achieve. That just to put them out there on the page, to embrace that. And yes, I mean, I suspect if you looked under any stone or at any case or any trial here in South Africa, you would find a microcosm, different microcosm of the country. But yes, there's something in the nature of Parys itself, this town which has so many sort of visible layers and so many different aspects. It's not just some abandoned or struggling or failing farming town, way out in the Free State. It's well known. It's a tourist hub. It's got all sorts of things going for it. The township of Tumahole, it's got great struggle credentials. It's got some real successes there. So it's not just one version of South Africa.
It's the multiple versions, I suppose, we find everywhere, in a sense. Do you think somebody who had just arrived in this country, unlike yourself, would have, been able to make sense of what happened there, or is it just impossible? Are we impossible to know without knowing? I mean, the sorrow in this book to me it permeated me for 2 or 3 days. Good sorrow, an important sorrow for so many people who live in such wretched blindness, in a sense, because there's just no attempt, to fix us in any way. Are we fixable? I mean, is it possible?
I don't think I'd have got through all these years, as you say, of conflict zones and so on without. I mean, I think it's affected me in the sense that I am wary of confrontation and of extremes and of the sort of casual talk of revolution and destruction and rebuilding. I am wary of those voices and tend to look things being glass half full, because the opposite is too scary. And I do think South Africa, politically and economically, is in a very precarious state. And having seen so many countries lose their way so quickly, and this applies, I mean, one can almost become a sort of doomsday say. I mean, I watch what's going on in Britain or in the US, and you think, oh my God, just remember what happened in Somalia or wherever else. These things could go wrong very quickly. But at the same time, I've seen countries like Georgia rebuild and very quickly. And I've seen the importance and the power of a few leaders. So I don't underestimate the trouble, the rot that these past few years, this lost decade has done here. But I shall remain optimistic.
You're like me, a pessimistic optimist. And also, as you said earlier on, you're able to move in this country and write as a writer without a feeling of, apart from physical safety, which all of us feel, we are able to work and do our jobs in this country. Civil society is incredibly strong, and we have the only social democrat government in the BRICS group at this point. So I tend to agree with you, but what you've done is you've shown how ordinary lives become entangled in great sweeps of history and current politics. And thank you very much for this respectful, beautiful, sorrowful ode to my country and yours. It's with you. The book is available through Pan Macmillan. There might be a deal if you do it through the Daily Maverick. I'm not sure. Any project after this one, or just normal boring old journalism?
Hopefully a mixture. Hopefully some more podcasts, and yes, definitely another book. But I don't have news for you on that front yet.
Okay, tell us a bit about the podcast. You've got about 1 minute left, so will we be able to listen to it from South Africa?
You should be. Yes, it'll be on BBC Sounds come mid-September. The title is Free State, and it's a 5-part series of about, I think, 17 minutes each, the podcast, and it'll also be on Radio 4 and on BBC World Service as a straightforward radio attempt to crush this vast, complicated story down into a handful of episodes.
So that means you've returned to Parys since then in order to record interviews and re-engage with the story, I take it.
I realized sort of halfway through the book process that I wanted to do a radio version. So I put away my dictaphone and got a larger microphone out. And yeah.
You're moving into multimedia, and I think I'm really looking forward to that. Everybody who's joined us, thank you very much for your time. It's been lovely chatting to you, Andrew. Take care.
Thank you, Marianne.
And this is one of those books that one keeps for many years and returns to because it has everything in it. So thank you to everybody. Thank you, Andrew. And
thank you.
And take care out there. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.